So, by reveal of preference, these last 3 lectures are my favorite of the course. What I mean by that is that these are like the things that I'm working on right now. So like I care about the issues a lot. Okay. So today we're going to apply monopoly theory to a big social problem, which is growing inequality in the US, unlike some other countries actually. And we'll talk about why even a libertarian might value redistribution, because it provides insurance against risks that people can't otherwise get insurance against. And we'll thus argue that redistribution under this view should try to maximize average utility, and that the utility of wealth is higher for the poor because of the concavity of wealth. And we'll talk about why logarithmic utility is a good approximation to that. We'll then build a framework for analyzing optimal tax based on these principles along 2 dimensions. First, the average tax rate, so the tax rate that's paid by most taxpayers. And we'll calibrate this using a log-logistic distribution of income. And then we'll talk about special surcharges for the rich using a Pareto distribution at the top end of the income distribution. We'll then talk about evidence on labor supply elasticities, which other than the distribution of income will be the other key parameter. And finally, we'll talk about an alternative theory of optimal taxation based on externalities that came out of a recent paper that I was working on. Okay, so income inequality comes in basically 3 brands. One is inequality at the bottom end of the distribution, which is usually called poverty, and is typically measured by the fraction of people falling below some threshold. Now the global poverty level is $1 per day, but of course in the US and other developed countries it's much higher. And in that sense it's a measure of relative deprivation and therefore inequality, and not just absolute deprivation. And this has not been significantly growing even in the US in recent years. The second, yeah.
Isn't even that the very lowest poor are decreasing? Is they're like getting more above that absolute lowest poverty?
Yeah, but even relative poverty defined according to a moving scale that's like a constant fraction of, say, what a median person is earning, that has not been increasing significantly. So like the very bottom inequality in the US has not been increasing.
Yeah, because in absolute numbers, like that lowest threshold is like people are just getting above that.
No, but I'm saying even if you keep that as a constant fraction of the median income,
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Why would you choose the median and not the mean, for instance?
Good question. I don't know. I mean, this is how a poverty line is usually defined.
The picture would be different.
Yeah, so, yeah, maybe that's true.
But the mean will be affected by top medians.
Yeah, and so it's not really,
Top
if you want to view poverty as sort of a measure of like, how much worse are the worst off people doing relative to a typical person, then this is the right way to think of it. Mid-range inequality is measured usually by the Gini Coefficient, which, for those of you who haven't seen it before, so we construct something called the Lorenz curve, which says if you're at this percentile of the income distribution, what percent of total national income do people below you have? So at 50th percentile, maybe only 20% of the income is held by those people. At 70th percentile, maybe only 40% of the income is held by those people, and so forth. If this were exactly a 45-degree line, then you would have total equality, right? Because 50% of the people would hold 50% of the wealth, etc. And the area between the 45-degree line and the Lorenz curve, let's call that area A, and then the total area of the triangle we'll call A plus B. So the Gini coefficient is that ratio. So it's a measure of how unequal things are, and it particularly loads on inequality throughout the main part of the income distribution. But to measure inequality at the very, very top, instead what's typically used is something called top income shares. Like what percentage of national income is captured by the top 10%, the top 1%, the top 0.1%, etc. And this measures concentration at the very top. And while Gini coefficient has been growing a bit in the US recently, it's really the top income shares that have taken off. Yeah.
So, why do we care about each of these three things? Like, I guess I often find myself caring about 1 and 3 because I think it's morally objectionable that people should starve, and like, I guess 3 for like political capture reasons, but I don't really care that much about 2.
Okay, so I'll show you a model where these are the relevant parameters, the 2 and 3. I think it's pretty easy for you to come up with a model where 1 is a relevant parameter. These models are going to be utilitarian models. There are lots of other models where other parameters of the distribution might matter. So other than that, I don't really know what to say to you. You know what I mean? Like they matter because they determine the optimum in some models that we would think about.
And then I guess the other objection to like utilitarianist models is the interpersonal comparison of utility.
Yeah, so we're gonna talk all about these types of normative issues throughout. So these are just some like striking facts which might in some models matter for optimal policy. And we'll talk about what models, we'll focus on this utilitarian model. We'll talk about some of its problems. That's about all we can accomplish in one class. So. Okay, so just to talk about the inequality at the top end of the income distribution. So the interesting thing is the share earned by top 5 to 10% has not really grown much at all. So it fell a little bit to the 40s, and it rose a little bit, but hardly at all since then. Top 5 to 1% has grown a little bit more, but not a ton. So it's grown by about 3 percentage points from the 50s where it bottomed out till recently. But the income of the top 1% has absolutely skyrocketed. So from 1978, when it reached its trough, it's gone from about 9% to over 21%. And this is a sharp contrast to what's happened in Europe. So the top 1% fell to the 50s, just like in the US, and then stayed there or even declined further over time. Yeah, Donnie.
Is there an effective tax policy on these differences or a particular sector like finance?
So this is all pre-tax, but I don't think that means that there isn't an effective tax policy. So I'll be at the end of class talking about like a natural mechanism through which less progressive taxes would lead to more pre-tax income inequality. Basically, there's a very simple mechanism, which is that if you're discouraging from work more the people who are earning a lot, you're also going to get less pre-tax earnings by those people, not just post-tax earnings. Right? So that's a very simple mechanism by which tax policy affects pre-tax, not just post-tax.
Or EITC might have an effect because it has like a very high marginal tax rate when you're pushing up from the very bottom, right?
Well, that actually would create more poverty at the very bottom. It wouldn't really create top income shares that are really high. So, but yes, it would have some impact. Tax policy in terms of marginal rates has just become massively less progressive in the United States, and that hasn't happened nearly as much in these other countries. That clearly is going to impact post-tax income inequality, but for the reasons I was just talking about, it could also impact pre-tax income inequality. And at the end of the lecture, I'll highlight one mechanism through which I think there's actually been a substantial effect on that. We have an estimate that this mechanism I'll talk about at the end could account for somewhere between half and all of the increase in top income shares under plausible calibrations. So, yeah.
So that graph was the top percentage, right?
Yeah.
So have the 1 to 5 and the 5 to 10 been similar to the US, or have they also gone down in Europe?
Oh, I haven't looked into that. I don't know. But everything is on, like Piketty and Zayas have this for like every country. There's something in your syllabus where they have like a database where you can ask any query you want like that. So you can check that out. Yeah, Albert.
Why does it fall in the 1950? Is it because of World War or something like that?
Why does it fall towards 1950? It really falls from the mid-30s. It really falls from 1929 with hiccups through to the 50s. And why is that? Well, I mean, the New Deal is probably a huge part of it. World War II is a huge part of it. The GI Bill is a big part of it, etc. I mean, just all the stuff that led to more, government intervention in the economy during those periods. So. Okay. Another thing to be aware of is that a huge part of inequality is not the inequality within countries. Most inequality in the world is inequality across countries, and that inequality across countries was really increasing for a long period of time and has been decreasing significantly since then. So even though there's been all this top income inequality in the US, inequality across countries grew dramatically until about the 1950s, started to level out, and then has been shrinking dramatically since the early 1980s. And that's in a much bigger overall source of inequality in the world. Yeah.
But isn't that mostly driven by China?
East Asian countries. I mean, yeah, that's true. I mean, Africa is still really poor. But China's, that's a huge number of people, so it's a huge effect. And India has been doing better as well. Many developing countries have been doing better.
I mean, it's not like a sort of a consistent thing across countries that.
Yeah, screw you.
It's pretty sad.
It's not a consistent thing that all countries converge. There are a couple of countries that were able to sort of catch up. A lot of countries in
Well,
Africa.
I don't think it's all driven by China. I think even if you took China out, this would still be true. So I mean, many East Asian countries have done this, and growth has slowed down significantly in those periods in developed countries. So, okay. So many libertarians and conservatives oppose redistribution, and I used to be one of these people. So I sort of empathize with this view. Some of the reasons that they give is they say, well, look, the rich earned what they got. Who has the right to take it away from them? Some have sort of a social Darwinist view, which is either literally we should give money to these people, they'll have more kids, and that'll sort of have some eugenic benefits, which actually the problem set will have you think a little bit about that sort of thing. But also just, well, they know better what to do with the money. They'll spend it on more socially productive things. The poor don't know what to do with their money, and they'll sort of waste it. Nozick argued that if we start from a fair arrangement of resources and then the rules are fair, we should just accept whatever outcome comes out of that. The Protestants have a view that the wealthy are sort of the chosen of God, and that you shouldn't undo what God has done. Ayn Rand argued that basically taxation is a form of violence and that property is an inviolable part of people's identities and that you can't take it away. Fascists have argued that that the process of redistributing wealth breeds class resentments, and that it's more important that countries feel that they're one coherent organic being, and you shouldn't foster these sorts of resentments through class warfare via taxation. Conservatives argue that each part of society has a specified role, and the taxation undermines those specified roles by rearranging and making it difficult for people to play their roles that they've come to play in society. Now, I think a lot of these arguments are actually quite interesting and powerful, and not all of them have been completely formalized in the literature. But I think that you can make a pretty compelling, quite libertarian argument for redistribution based on something that comes out of an old Christian saying from John Bradford, that there, but for the grace of God, go I. So let me go through the argument related to that. So John Harsanyi, and actually William Vickery even before him, and came up with an idea that is often attributed to John Rawls that gives a pretty compelling case for why even a libertarian would want to favor some forms of redistribution. Has he been here? No. Can somebody else summarize that argument to me? Very classic argument. Yeah, Arvid?
it's like before you get into society, like abstracting from your own position.
Yeah.
You want to look at what are the chances you get up in each population if you assume a uniform. You want to have like as less risk as possible because you might end up in the lower end. So you want to like smooth out your utility if you're somehow risk averse.
Exactly. It's sort of like, people are always buying insurance against various risks that they face in their life, right? And, I think a lot of libertarians would say, well, imagine that insurance just couldn't exist right now for some reason, but we know that everyone would have wanted to buy insurance had they had the chance to. I think many libertarians would say, well, they didn't actually buy the insurance, but let's treat it as if they did anyways, if we knew that they would have chosen that, because that's what they would have chosen, what they would have wanted, right? But one of the most important things that you need insurance against is your position in life. Which parents did you have? Ones that abused you or ones that nurtured you well? Which country were you born in? What town were you born in? What opportunities did you have as a kid, etc.? And a lot of people would buy insurance against those types of things. They're bigger risks even than getting sick, right? But people can't buy insurance against those things because they're too young to do so, right? Sometimes they're not even born yet, right? And therefore the government should act as if people had bought insurance against those things. And how does it do that? It taxes away from people when they're doing well and redistributes to people when they're doing poorly, right? And so this policy suggests maximizing people's utility behind the veil of ignorance about who they would be in society, right? Yeah.
So what if we have something like state-dependent utility and we transfer income from a poor state of reality to a good state?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a relevant potential consideration, but the question is, do you actually believe that? I mean, look, of course you can always invent anything you want, but I think most people believe, and I think it's just plausible to imagine, that had you had the chance to make a decision about this, you wouldn't have wanted to do that. But that's what you have to base these things on. I mean, of course, you can get anything by cooking up some sort of model, right?
Is it not like Carsani argues against the Friedman Savage, is that you have that over like a certain limited range where you have this, where you prefer risk?
Yeah.
Like if you want to go to college because you're taking a risk to get a good degree. But that overall it's because it's so huge that
There's just no way that people are overall risk-seeking, and I'll give you an argument for that in just a moment. So Adam Smith proposed another way of thinking about this. He said that one should take the perspective in making social policy of an outside observer who's not part of that society, who has nothing at stake, and think about how that outside observer would make a judgment about the distribution of resources within that society. Okay, so thus, we should try to maximize average utility. This principle is called utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham described it as the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And it's usually formalized by the idea that people have some utility that depends on their income and also on other things like leisure, identity, or how enjoyable their work is, but those things are separable from the utility they derive from their income. And income is assumed to be concave in consumption because of risk aversion. Basically, people run out of good things to do with their wealth as they start to get more money. Initially, you spend it on staying alive, getting a house, being able to have a car at all. And as you get wealthier, you're spending it on private jets and concerts with Justin Bieber for your daughter, which maybe are not as valuable, right, to you, per dollar spent. So note that you don't necessarily want to buy insurance against every bad thing that happens to you, only to the extent that it changes the marginal utility you have of wealth. And in fact, someone who's disabled might not value money as much because they don't have as many things to do with it. So that's an example that I actually think is plausible of what Jose was saying. And we'll return to this point in a little bit. Okay, so risk aversion alone gives some motive for redistribution. But to get more specific, we need to come up with a particular form for the utility function. And this will determine exactly how much redistribution we want to do. Luckily, there's some pretty compelling evidence about what the right form of this is, just the way there was with Zipf's law pretty compelling evidence about the distribution of people's talents. In particular, I think there's quite a lot of evidence suggesting that the best approximation to utility is log utility. And this is a very easy form to work with. Interestingly, it was also the first form of utility function ever proposed back in the 17th century by Bernoulli. And it's still basically the best that we've got. So it's super intuitive. Basically, the same percentage increase in your income leads to the same change in your well-being at no matter what income level you're at. So like doubling your income increases your well-being by the same amount no matter how high your income is. So for example, doubling from $50,000 to $100,000 a year creates the same increase in your happiness as doubling from $100,000 to $200,000. Mathematically, it's very convenient, as we'll see below, and there's a lot of empirical support for it. One example that I really like is from Dan Sachs and his co-authors, who studied these subjective well-being surveys, where you ask people to rate on a ladder of life running from 1 being the worst life you can imagine yourself living to 10 being the best life you can imagine yourself living. Where would you place yourself? And the reports that people give on this are called H. And what they find is that this equation, H is equal to 0.35 log of I plus epsilon, fits incredibly robustly, incredibly well, which is pretty compelling evidence for log income. So in particular, here's a whole bunch of countries, about like 180 countries. Each country is represented by a dot, but also a line representing the regression coefficient within the country across different incomes. And here's the line across countries. And the interesting thing you see is the relationship between countries is almost the same for all countries, and it's parallel to the relationship across countries, which suggests that contrary to prior work, there is not much of a relative income effect. That basically within countries, the relationship is the same across countries. So it's not how well off you are relative to other people in your country, it's just an absolute level of income effect.
Is this also called like the Easterlin hypothesis?
Yeah, the idea that there was a relative income thing. So if the Easterlin hypothesis had been true, you would have expected the within-country relationship to be much sharper than the cross-country relationship, and you don't see that. Okay, so designing a tax system involves a wide range of issues. Do you want to tax income versus consumption versus capital income? How do you want to redistribute the money that's collected? What deductions should you offer, and what should the tax base be? Should you have special or targeted deductions, or should you just give uniform deductions to everybody? What should the inheritance tax be, and how should tax burden fall on different generations? How many different brackets should you have, and what should the tax rate be at each bracket? How should the administrative and monitoring process work? What programs should the government spend money on that it raises through the tax system? Should there be an earned income tax credit or work subsidies of other forms? So all these are really interesting issues, but probably the two most perennially relevant issues, and ones about which there is the most debate, is overall how high taxes should be, and should they be flat or progressive, especially at the very top. Okay, so in thinking about these, there's a basic question, which is, if we value money in the hands of the poor more than money in the hands of the rich, why should we not just equalize everybody's income? And Arvid, what's the standard argument given for why we should not just equalize everyone's income?
Because then you're taking away the incentives to work.
Yes.
So it has no effect anymore.
Exactly. So the more you tax, the less people work. And in fact, beyond some point, taxing will be counterproductive, because you'll just be taking from someone who is, you'll be extracting less in total from the rich. And therefore, you'll make the poor worse off as well, even. So there's a fundamental equity versus efficiency trade-off. And so in maximizing average utility, you have to take into account the constraints, both that we're going to use these simple instruments that I talked about, a surcharge on the rich and a linear tax, and that raising taxes will lead people to work less by the substitution effect. And we'll assume that we give back all taxes as a lump sum to all people. Now to keep things simple, I'm going to ignore the income effects of these lump sum transfers, as well as of the taxes more generally. You can easily put in income effects, but it makes things a bit messier, and research has found that these income effects don't actually matter all that much for the level and structure of the redistribution. Okay, so we're going, so then the only effects we're going to care about is the reduction in work that comes through the labor supply elasticity. And this is an elasticity that measures how much less you work if your wages fall by a certain percentage. And we're going to assume that people currently earning an income I have an average elasticity of labor supply epsilon bar of I. And the income that they're going to end up earning is going to be, if we just have a linear tax, which is what I'm going to focus on to begin with, 1 minus the tax times their income, plus the tax times the average income in the population, because that gets refunded back to them as a lump sum. Okay. So people's post-tax wages are going to be the wages they earn times 1 minus the tax rate. So if there's a 1 percentage point increase in the tax rate, how much is that going to cause their total earnings to fall in percentage terms given what we've assumed? Oliver, could you try to figure that out either on the board or on a piece of paper? So we said that if their post-tax wage falls by 1%, then that's going to lead their income to fall by epsilon percent. So what would a 1 percentage point change in taxes cause their income to fall by?
So a 1% change in your post-tax earnings causes your income to fall by epsilon percent.
Yeah. And so if I have a 1 percentage point change in the tax rate, how much is that going to cause?
It's going to cause your post-tax earnings to fall by tau, isn't it? So just the tau.
Okay. So the tax rate is T, first of all. But second of all, how much is your by what percentage is your post-tax wage going to fall when the tax increases by 1 percentage point?
So there's going to be 2 components to this: the amount that you're going to work less and the amount that you're earning less.
Okay, no, I'm not even talking about that. I'm just talking about the mechanical effect on how much you're going to earn.
Yeah.
So that's your post-tax wage. By what percentage does that number fall when the tax rate increases by 1 percentage point? All I'm asking you to do is to take the log derivative of that number, basically, with respect to T. Take the logarithm of that.
So it's just going to be like 1 over W tau.
Okay, so if you take the derivative of that, right, you get negative W.
Yeah.
But then what fraction is that of its original level? So it's going to be negative W divided by W times 1 minus T.
Yeah.
So it's 1 over 1 minus T. Right, so that's the percent by which that changes when the tax changes by 1, incremental unit. And then you're going to multiply that by the elasticity and then by the income that the person earns, right? In order to get the change in people's income.
Should we you multiply that number by T to get the percentage of?
No, because I didn't say when it changes by 1 percentage point. Because the tax is measured in percentage points, right? So that's a incrementing T. Yeah. Okay. So the amount, so average income in the population when the tax increases is going to fall by what percentage? Well, at every income level, it falls by epsilon bar times I over 1 minus T times the income at that level. We then have to integrate by the density of incomes, and divide by the average income, because that's the base for taking the elasticity, and we get that average income falls by epsilon bar over 1 minus t%, where epsilon bar is the income-weighted average elasticity in the population. So now I'm going to ignore income effects of the lump sum transfer. The total welfare that we earn in the population is the logarithm of the income that everybody gets, right? And by the envelope theorem, the only effect of the tax on how much you get yourself is going to be just tax times your income. You're not going to take into account any change in your income that you're earning, because that's going to go into the leisure, which was that additively separable thing we had before by your envelope condition, right? So it's just from the perspective of the individual, how much he's getting changes. And if we take the derivative of this, what do we get? Well, we've got this logarithm, so we need to do 1 over the post-tax and transfer income that he's getting. And then on the top, we have the amount that this term changes, which is that the tax goes up, so that gives us 1 times the average income, minus the average income goes down, so that causes a fall of that amount. And then everybody loses their income directly. And so that becomes 1 minus tax rate times the average elasticity divided by 1 minus the tax rate times the product of the average income and the average of 1 over their post-tax and transfers income, which we're going to call their welfare rate. Because that's how much value society gets from giving $1 more to that person, because under logarithmic utility, that's just 1 over their post-tax and transfers income. And then we're going to do minus the average income multiplied by the average of income multiplied by their welfare rate from this term here. That's the derivative, and we want to set that equal to 0 to find the optimum, right? So let's define sigma of t to be the negative covariance of income divided by average income with welfare weight divided by average welfare weight. Why will that have a negative covariance? Because the higher income I have, the lower welfare weight I get, right? And the more the income is varying, because that's moving both the welfare weights and the income, the greater this sigma is going to be. So it's sort of a measure of inequality, right? And the higher tax rates are, the more that's going to create equality and reduce the size of this. So that makes this a function of taxes.
So,
yeah.
I'm
yeah, Oliver.
not quite getting this.
Yeah.
So I bar is the average income.
Yeah.
W bar is the average welfare.
No,
the average weight. Sorry.
Yeah, weight.
And so, why is I bar W bar not equal to I W bar?
There's a covariance between those two things.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So these things negatively covary with each other.
But isn't your welfare weight determined by your income?
It is. And that's why they covary with each other.
Okay.
So it's a measure of inequality.
Where did we pull this welfare weight from? We just defined it from that derivative.
Yeah, it's just 1 over your post-tax and transfers income, because that's how much we value giving an extra $1 to you. Okay, so that we can then plug this into here and solve out, and we get that the optimal tax rate is going to be equal to this measure of inequality over the elasticity of labor supply on average, plus that measure of inequality. And that's going to be positive because the wealthier people have a lower marginal welfare weight. And we notice that the tax is going to be increasing in the degree of inequality and decreasing in the elasticity. And Luke, is Luke here? Luke Schmerl. Could somebody else explain why that is intuitive given the equity efficiency trade-off we've been talking about? why it should be increasing in inequality and decreasing in the, yeah, Connor?
Well, just because you have less equity if there's more inequality, so then it's optimal to have a higher tax rate.
To try to increase that amount of
And then
equity.
with the epsilon, that's just like the extent to which taxing the super rich is kind of reduced.
Exactly, exactly. So it directly captures this equity efficiency trade-off. And so this gives a very, very simple formalization of the equity efficiency trade-off. If the inequality is getting large, except when you're at very high taxes, we're going to have taxes going to 1. If the elasticity goes to 0, we'll also have taxes going to 1, and vice versa. So the more inequality and the less elasticity, the higher the tax rate. Yeah, Arvind.
2 questions. One, we're using a covariance, so how sensitive is it to level changes? And like not that we're using a correlation to like standardized.
Oh, but you do standardize it because this is a standardized covariance divided by the averages of the 2
okay.
variables. It's not a correlation because it's not standardized by their variances. It's standardized by their means, but it is standardized.
Okay. And then because you would probably have nonlinearities within that covariance, because I would assume like if you have a certain inequality, you raise the tax and you reduce it, like the covariance could remain the same if it's kind of, so there are nonlinearities within that weighting probably, that's, because there's like,
I don't think, I haven't proven it, but I'm pretty sure that that thing is monotone decreasing in the tax rate. Okay, so that's going to cover the taxes that we charge to most Americans, the stuff that's relevant through the main part of the income distribution. But Obama, not so recently now because these slides are slightly old, but Obama has for years been proposing a surcharge on the super rich. Let's say that those are people earning above $1 million. And an important thing to note is that the social welfare weight on these people is tiny compared to on most Americans, right? So the weight on someone earning $1 million is 1/20th of the weight of someone earning 46K. And so we can, as a simplification, basically say all we want to do is extract as much revenue as we can from these people, right? So suppose we raise the tax rate that is charged only on income above $1 million. Let's let the average income of people who are earning above $1 million be I bar sub 10 to the 6th. Then if we raise this tax rate, there are going to be 2 effects. Can someone describe what those 2 effects will be? On how much revenue we earn? Yeah, Miles.
Yeah, so they're going to work less.
Yeah.
That value that we determined before.
Yeah.
That's on the lower times T.
Yeah.
And you're also going to get more out of them for you have to do work.
Exactly. So there's like a mechanical increase in revenue, and then there's a behavioral reduction in the revenue that you get. Okay. And in particular, those who are above $1 million, their revenue is going to fall by the income that they earn times the average elasticity over 1 minus t, as Miles said. And the total effect on revenue, therefore, is going to be their income times 1 minus t sub 10 to the 6th times epsilon bar I over 1 minus t 10 to the 6th minus 10 to the 6th, because you don't earn any revenue on the people, on the revenue below 10 to the 6th, right? So we have to subtract that off from this. And the optimal tax is going to equate this on average over all people above $1 million to 0, right? And so Saez, on the basis of this, derived a formula for optimal taxation. Once we do it on average, this becomes the income-weighted average elasticity above $1 million. And if we now let alpha be defined as I bar sub 10 to the 6th over I bar sub 10 to the 6th minus 10 to the 6th, so that is how much on average these people are earning divided by how much on average they're earning above $1 million, we can, by the same derivation we did before, derive the optimal tax rate. And Franklin, can you come to the board and do that?
All right.
Try to derive the optimal tax rate by setting this thing equal to 0 and using this definition of alpha.
Alright, so we want the
You want to set that stuff up at the top equal to 0, and use my definition of alpha to get a simple expression for the optimal tax rate. You've got to solve for t. Try subtracting 1 from both sides.
Oh, okay. So that becomes 1 over alpha.
Yeah. You're missing a negative, but on the left-hand side.
Okay, oh yeah, it's okay. Okay, so t epsilon equals, so alpha t epsilon equals t, alpha t epsilon, t alpha epsilon equals 1, so t equals 1 over alpha epsilon equals 1.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yep.
Cool.
Nicely done. Okay, exactly. So alpha measures, yeah, Kevin,
Sorry, just a question. Why are we equating that effect to 0 again?
because we're trying to maximize total revenue, and this was the derivative of revenue, right? Okay, so alpha measures upper tail income inequality, as we'll talk about in a minute. And so again, the equity efficiency trade-off emerges because the smaller alpha is, which means more inequality, the more tax we're going to have, and the bigger elasticity is the less tax we're going to have. So again, we have an equity efficiency trade-off. Robert, under what circumstances is it going to be optimal for taxes to be progressive? In other words, for this to be greater than the expression that we derived before.
So, I mean, that's going to be if there's probably greater inequality, higher the inequality is. So,
But we had a measure of inequality of the other expression as well. So it's not going to just be the level of inequality. It's going to be what?
Also the elasticity of labor.
Yeah, so both of those things matter, but I'm saying when is this number going to be higher than the number before, which also had a measure of inequality and also had a measure of elasticity in it?
Sure.
Anyone else want to? Yeah, Jack?
We can see that this looks a lot like the previous tax rate.
Yeah.
Just replace 1 over alpha with sigma t.
Yeah.
So if 1 over alpha is larger than sigma t for the rich population,
Yeah.
that
Exactly. So what this is basically saying is if income inequality is higher at the top end of the spectrum than over the distribution as a whole, which obviously in the United States we've been seeing that that's been growing, right? So that suggests that we should be making the tax system more progressive because inequality at the top end relative to the middle is growing. Yeah, Oliver.
So just the first approach, we just say we have some distribution, we want to maximize the wealth again there. And now we're saying we're just going to try and maximize the revenue from the people on.
That just turns out to be a very good approximation
top.
once you get up at the very top.
And that's because the weights are so small for
Yeah.
people at the top.
Exactly.
And so why would we, if the weights really are small, why would we expect the results to be any different between the two?
Because the first approach is a linear tax over the population as a whole.
Okay, yeah,
and this is a tax above a certain threshold with no welfare. I mean, they're quite different things in a bunch of different senses. But it turns out they both come down to this equity efficiency trade-off, and so it ends up being, as Jack was saying, you know, the difference between inequality at the top versus inequality throughout the mid-range, and as well, which Jack didn't mention, how much more elastic these guys are relative to the typical guys.
I was getting it.
Yeah, he was getting it. Anyways.
Yeah, but that's what
yeah.
I was going to say.
Yeah.
And we could expect like rich people to maybe a higher
Well, I don't know. We'll talk about that in a second, but yeah.
because they can like more easily like I don't know cheat.
Well, the question is that a real labor supply elasticity or not? It depends on how you look at it. Okay, so to try to get a sense for alpha and for sigma of t, I first want to use a log logistic approximation to the distribution of income throughout the mid-range, which is pretty accurate. It's pretty similar to log linear. Sorry, log normal, which is quite accurate. So 1 over, it turns out that under log logistic, which is really nice, and this is again answering Oliver's question, why does the Gini matter? Yeah. So under log logistic distribution, which is a good approximation, beta, which is going to be the key parameter for this thing, is just exactly 1 over g, which is 0.45 in the US. Mean income in the US is 46,000. So that gives us alpha in this. Sorry, the alpha is used in 2 different ways. I'm sorry about that. Of 32K about. And if you throw this into Mathematica, this gives us sigma value as a function of t being about this. So then what we can do is we can throw this into our equation where we had t is equal to sigma of t over epsilon. And for different values of epsilon, we can find the intersection between that and the 45-degree line to find the optimal tax rate. And you get that if elasticity is 0.1, the optimal tax is about 65%. If it's 0.3, it's about 50%, and so on. Okay. Now calculating alpha is actually even easier because this turns out to correspond precisely to the alpha in the Pareto tail. Okay, so to calculate that, you can just take the integral in the Pareto tail of what is the amount of income above 10 to the 6th, conditional on being there, conditional on being there, which is divided by the total mass above that. And you just do some integration, which I won't go through in too much detail, using the power law, and you get very quickly that I bar sub 10 to the 6th is 10 to the 6th times alpha over alpha minus 1. So that means that I bar 10 to the 6th over I bar 10 to the 6th minus 10 to the 6th is exactly equal to alpha. So alpha is a very natural measure of inequality. At the top, it's precisely this Pareto tail thing that we've been talking about. Now, Piketty and Sayas argue that this is about 1.5. It might actually be a little bit higher than that, like 2 or 3. But with 1.5, we get that for these elasticities, the tax rate should be about 0.87, 0.69, 0.57, or 0.4, respectively, which compares to, as we got, 0.67, 0.48, 0.38, and 0.26 over the main range, which says that because inequality at the top is higher than throughout the middle range, for a given set of elasticities, if they were the same, we should have higher taxes, we should have progressive taxes. This tends to weigh in favor of having progressive taxes. And while, of course, we only talked about the highest rate, it's likely that it's smooth between these, so there probably should be somewhat of a gradual ramp up. Okay, so now let's talk about evidence on elasticities. Unfortunately, almost all the evidence we have on elasticities is based on very short-term changes. And this can have several biases. So on the one hand, it might be biased upward. Why is that? Well, if you just lower taxes for 1 year, people might try to earn a lot of income in that 1 year that they just wouldn't earn later by just basically shifting around their tax liability, whatever, right? On the other hand, they don't have time to change many things in their life during just 1 year. And so the real labor supply elasticity might be higher over many years, just like we think in many cases long-run elasticities are higher than short-run elasticities. For example, as we'll talk about in a minute, when tax rates are lower, people might choose more lucrative careers. If they do that, it's unlikely that they would do that for just 1 year's tax change, right? They would probably only do that if taxes changed over a long period of time. Yeah, Luke.
So, but to what extent does like vacation time or hours worked per week, like to what extent do people choose like hours per week versus to what extent do people choose career paths? Because you maybe would expect an upward shock, like I just won't take vacation this year, I'll work 80-hour weeks this year. I would do that in 40 years, but.
Yeah, exactly. That's possible. My guess is that things are more elastic in the long run, but there are effects that can make them more elastic in the short run.
Do you know like to what extent people do respond in that way?
Nobody knows. I mean, these are some of the hardest problems out there in economics. I mean, I don't know. So I mean, I think, okay, I'll give you an informal argument that long-term career choice elasticity is pretty high, but you have to believe a very strong identifying assumption, which is that basically the relative wages in finance compared to academia have increased about 3 to 4-fold since the 1960s till today. And in response, the ratio of people in academia versus finance used to be 3 academics for every person in finance in the 50s or 60s, and now it's about 4 people in finance for every person in academia. So that's like roughly a 4-fold change for like a 4-fold change in the wages. Or is there more than 4-fold change? It's like a 12-fold change for a 4-fold change in the wages. So that says that the elasticity is about 3, which is pretty massive, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, that depends on the assumption that there's been no change in how much people wanted to be in different professions, that it was all just based on the change in wages, which to a first approximation I think is about right. But I don't know, that's what you think. Okay, so these studies have indicated that the labor supply elasticity of the rich is low in terms of how much like work we can measure them actually doing. But the amount of income that they report is very elastic in the short term, or not very elastic, but significantly elastic. And why, Robert, might you think that would be true?
So, I guess like rich people have a lot of like places they can put their money, like tax havens, or they can avoid taxes.
But why would that affect their short-run versus long-run behavior in this sort of way?
Like if it's gonna make it more lucrative to get a higher pay because you know you can evade the taxes for a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's easy to shift income across years, but it's harder to like work less in this year. You see what I mean? And so that makes like income shifting or stuff that only affects how much income you report, not how much work you do, more elastic in the short run than is how much work you're actually doing. Okay, so thus maybe I think a lot of people in literature think that the right number is maybe 0.3 at the highest or closer to 0.1 for the labor supply elasticity of the rich, though of course this is again based on short-term stuff, so in the long run it might be bigger. This number that I said to maybe it could be as big as 3, right? But estimates on the middle class suggest that it's a bit higher than 0.1, about maybe 0.5, and a lot of that comes from married women switching into and out of the labor force. That suggests that we should have about a 40% average income tax rising to about 80% on the wealthiest, which is much more progressive than the current system. Now, a natural question is this actually what we should do, or is there a flaw in some step of the logic we've gone through? And I think there's many opportunities for there to be a flaw. Yeah, Donnie, what did you want to say?
I was going to say that maybe you think it should be even more progressive. You think that the log is not the perfect measure of utility, and that actually, as it gets higher, like eventually doubling it still doesn't reflect that. You know, like we see.
So I don't I basically believe the log is right, but yes, if you're more risk averse, you'd want to have more redistribution, for sure.
And just to be clear, when you say like a 40% average income tax, you're meaning that like the
government share of the economy would roughly be about 40%, something like that.
Yeah.
Or the average rate over all people would be about 40%. Yeah, Albert.
What happens if it just tax consumption, like taxing the rich consume more?
That makes it hard to have high progressive marginal rates, though it is possible. But it's in steady state, they should be relatively similar under some conditions. But I'm not sure I believe those conditions, because I think there's a lot of really rich people who like just having money, even if they don't consume it. And if that's the case, they would be quite different. A consumption tax would be like preferable, because it would like encourage people to just earn money and then not consume it, which is actually good for society. Yeah, Kevin.
What do the numbers look like for optimal tax if you like have something that's a much higher elasticity, like what you said for the 12 or the 3 example?
3? Oh, it would be tiny. So with an elasticity of 1, it's 0.4. Let me just go through and do it. So imagine that we had alpha equals 3, which might actually be more realistic, and we had an elasticity of 3. Then we would get 1/3 over 1/3 plus 3, which is, that's equal to 1 over 10. So 10%, right on the top. So it could be very, very, very low, at least in principle. Okay, so yeah, that's a lot.
So that assumption that we made that like taxes are like distributed in lump sum,
Yeah,
that like never happens in real life, and a lot of people would like it to happen.
yeah.
Does that like affect the result much? Because I feel like it's a very efficient way probably to redistribute.
So you're thinking that there might be a leakier bucket?
Yeah.
Well, that's one possibility, but it's also possible that it's used for public goods, which would make taxation more beneficial. So I would guess on average that it's used for public goods, but that's my view. I'm sort of lefty in that sense. Yeah, Singh.
Instead of lump sum transfer,
Yeah.
like how about if we transfer the money proportional to their weight on loan? So that would be
Give more. Well, but that's basically the same as having like lump sum plus a progressive tax that like takes some of that away. Because you can always give like everything back lump sum and then just adjust the tax rates so that you can give stuff that way. You see what I mean? Because if you're like taxing people, if you like give stuff lump sum to people and then tax it away, then that will mean like the people who are getting the most on net are the people at the bottom, right? And so you can always play with the analysis that way. Okay, so all of this is based on short-term elasticities, right? And my basic belief is that the reason you get such low short-term elasticities is if you've ever met an ambitious person, all of you guys probably went to college with people who are very smart and ambitious, these people almost never slack off because of lack of incentives. Like someone who's ambitious is going to be at the top of whatever greasy totem pole you put them onto. It's really just a question of what greasy totem pole you put them onto, right?
How do you
what? Greasy totem pole?
Greasy?
Do you know what totem? Like,
I know what a totem pole is.
Yeah, it's greasy. It's like it's hard to get up. You know what I mean? You keep slipping down, and they're like trying to get up. It's like an expression, for like the corporate world, right? Yeah, Oliver.
Do you have like empirical evidence on this, or?
No, it's just this is my casual empiricism
Yep.
from meeting people like this. It's just like I can't imagine like taxes go up and suddenly they're like, I don't want to be the guy with the biggest dick. You know what I mean?
What happens if you put a tax on our grades?
What?
You put a tax on the grades? Like the better grade you get, and then you get the lower grade.
Well, no, but you wouldn't actually reverse the ordering. You would just make incremental change, not very much. And if you're only comparing yourself to other people, it doesn't matter anyway, right? So in the 1950s, you know, people who were really successful went into academia, government, engineering, and now almost everybody goes into finance, right? And this is driven probably by the 3 to 4 times relative wage change. And that suggests that long-run elasticities might be much larger. And under the theory, that says we should have 10% tax rates. We should have really, really low tax rates if this is true. And the question is, you know, why does the theory say that? Well, it says it's really, really bad that back in the 1950s, because taxes were so high, people were doing all this wasteful, like academia, government, and engineering as ways of taking leisure and like not working as hard as they should have been doing. And it's so much better that now that we have lower tax rates, people are doing the much more productive activity of finance, right? And the question is, do we really believe this? Kevin, what do you think? Does that sound like a plausible story to you of why it's good that tax rates are lower now?
No.
Why not?
I mean, it just seems like they're, like, the wage increase in finance, like, has to have come from somewhere. And, like, assume that it came from the fact that it might be a more efficient field. Like, maybe that's somewhat true, but,
yeah.
I don't know. I'm not entirely convinced that efficiency is what drives wages in that sector to be particularly higher than like engineering, government, or academia.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people share this view that people are not necessarily being compensated just for their like social contribution in these areas. And perhaps different professions have different externalities, and therefore this can give an alternative basis for optimal taxation, not as a form of redistribution, but instead as a way of charging different incomes for the different externalities they have. So if you read someone like Karl Marx, right, or Ayn Rand, it's not like Karl Marx is arguing, well, the rich are great and they're doing really good things for the world, but we can tax them and they still will keep doing all these great things for the world, right? He thinks that they're parasites who are stealing what everybody else is producing. And if you read Ayn Rand, she doesn't say, well, you know, the rich will just completely shirk if you tax them. In fact, Atlas Shrugged is all about how the rich won't shirk until you like are practically enslaving them, right? And so to calibrate this type of a theory, and so my point is that these guys, you know, it's not really plausible that the views of the left and the right are driven by their views about elasticities or inequality. They're really driven by whether they think that, you know, people who are rich are doing good things for the world or not, right? So to calibrate this sort of a theory, you need 3 things. So, and this is what I do in my paper with Ben Lockwood and Charlie Nathanson. So, as above, we need some assumptions in the theory. So we assume, for what I'm going to show you, that there's no correlation between the elasticities of people switching across professions and their externalities conditional on their income. So like all the people who are going to, in response to a tax change, switch out of a given income are representative of people at that income. And in this case, you just want to set the tax rate at every point to undo the average externality of people at that income. Then the second thing you need is data on the distribution of income by profession. And the way that we got this was to combine data from the Treasury with data on Harvard students that surveyed them about the income that they were earning in different things. We were really focused on the people at the top who we think have a lot of flexibility across professions. And finally, you have to measure the externalities in each profession, which is a hard thing to do. And so Oliver, what did we do in the paper to address the fact that it's sort of hard or subjective? So one approach was to just choose some representative examples, which was a major thing that we did. So we did ones sort of, we thought, measured the Tea Party views or the Occupy Wall Street views about what the value of different professions were. But you can also go on an online applet, which would allow us to do a survey. But we have an online applet where you can go and plug in your own views about what externalities are, and it will tell you what you should think optimal taxes are according to the theory. Okay, so let me show you what the distributions of income by professions look like according to our calibration. So as you see, something like teaching, this is conditional on each income on a logarithmic scale. What fraction of people are in different professions among the talented people that are sort of representative of people who went to Harvard? So down at low incomes, or sorry, moderately low incomes, there's a lot of teachers, academics, doctors, computers and science type people. At the very bottom, it's all arts and entertainment. So basically the only way that someone from Harvard ends up at this part of the income distribution is if they're in the arts or entertainment. On the other hand, at the top end, there's a ton of finance people, management people, etc. So what you get is that if you're an Occupy Wall Street person who thinks that finance and management suck, you should have high tax rates. If you're a Tea Party person who thinks those things are great and arts and entertainment suck, you should have negative tax rates, actually. If you're Charlie Nathanson, who basically thinks there's no externalities, you should have no taxes. And if you're me and Ben, who think that academia and computer stuff is great, that arts and entertainment isn't so great, and that management is not bad, that finance is really bad, and that law is pretty bad, then what you think is you should have a massive subsidy on getting into the middle class, because that's where all these like really good things are. And then you should have moderately high tax rates from then on. Okay, thanks guys.